Don was a quiet man. He worked alone, repaired things no one noticed, and liked the silence of deep space. On Hollow Reach, a big space station near the edge of human territory, Don had been doing the same job for 6 years. He'd fixed lights, checked air systems, and made sure doors didn't get stuck. That morning, the station lights flickered. He sighed, grabbed his tool bag, and headed toward Cargo Bay 3. The cargo bay was huge, full of crates, storage, units, and old parts. It was dark and cold inside. Most workers didn't come here unless they had to. Dan didn't mind. He climbed down a narrow ladder and walked between tall stacks of crates. As he moved closer to the power hub, he heard something strange. A soft sound, like breathing or crying. Dan stopped. He turned his flashlight toward the sound. Something moved behind the crates. He stepped closer. "Hello," he said, his voice echoing a little. A small shape jumped, and it froze. Dan walked around slowly and saw a child. No, not a human child. Its skin was smooth and light blue. Its large dark eyes stared at him. Its arms were thin, and it had 3 fingers on each hand. The child looked afraid. Dan raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "It's okay," he said gently. "I won't hurt you." The alien child didn't speak, but watched him carefully. Then, to Dan's surprise, it took a small step forward. Dan knelt down. "Are you lost?" The child didn't answer. Instead, it reached out a hand and touched Dan's chest, just above his heart. For a moment, Dan felt something warm, not in his body, but in his mind, a strange peace, like being remembered by someone you love. Then the child moved closer and wrapped its thin arms around him. Dan froze. The hug was soft but full of meaning. He didn't understand it, but he didn't pull away. After a moment, the child let go. It looked up at him and smiled. Dan smiled back. "Well, you're not from around here, are you?" Just then, the station's AI spoke through the comm system. "Unidentified life form detected in Cargo Bay 3. Medical and security teams are on their way." Dan stood up. "Looks like we're going to have company," he said softly. The child held his hand tightly. 10 minutes later, the door hissed open. 2 humans in white medical suits entered first, followed by a group of tall, elegant aliens. Their skin was the same light blue as the child's. They wore long, flowing robes with soft colors that shifted like water. At the front stood a female. Her eyes were calm, and her voice was clear when she spoke. "Step away from the child." Dan looked down. The child was gripping his hand with surprising strength. "I think he's scared," Dan said. The woman stepped forward, her eyes studied. "Him." Then she looked at the child. "Luma," she said softly. The child turned his head but didn't move away from Dan. The woman knelt down and spoke in her own language. The child said nothing. Then she stood and faced Dan again. "I am Sorel, mother of the child. He has chosen you." Don blinked. "Oh, chosen me for what?" Sorel tilted her head. "You are his father now." The room went silent. Dan looked around. The medics exchanged confused glances. One of the security guards raised an eyebrow. "Wait, what do you mean by father?" Don asked. "In our culture," Cyril said, "a child in danger may choose a protector. If the bond is made, it cannot be broken. The chosen becomes family. Blood is not required. The bond is real." Don looked down at Luma. The child was still holding his hand. "I was just doing my job," Dan said. And yet Cyril replied, "He chose you. Not with words, but with soul touch. It is sacred to us." Dan's head spun. I'm just a maintenance worker. Fix doors and lights. I don't know anything about raising alien children." Cyril nodded. Dad. "Him, he trusts you. That is more than training." Dan stepped back slightly. "There has to be someone else. Someone better. He should be with his own kind." Sorel's voice softened. "If you reject him, it will break his spirit. The bond once made leaves a mark on both minds. If you walk away now, he will carry the pain forever." Dan looked at Luma again. The child met his eyes. "He'll fear no only hope." It was too much. Too fast. But something inside Dan shifted. He had no family, no friends, just tools and machines. Now suddenly, this child had chosen him. The station commander entered the room, clearly annoyed. "What's going on here?" Cyril turned. "The child has bonded with the human. It is final." The commander raised an eyebrow. "Dan, you're telling me Dan is now this kid's father?" "Yes," Cyril said. "By Yalari law and by the child's choice." Don felt everyone looking at him. He didn't know what to say. He looked down again. Luma squeezed his hand and said in a small voice, "Da." It wasn't English, but it was clear. Don knelt down and touched Luma's shoulder. "All right," he whispered. "I'll stay." Cyril nodded once. "Then the bond is complete." The room stayed quiet for a few seconds longer. Then the commander sighed. "Well, Dan, looks like your job just got a lot more interesting." Dan sat on the edge of the small bed in his quarters, staring at the wall. His tool bag was still by the door, untouched. In the corner of the room, the alien child Luma was curled up in a soft blanket, quietly watching Dan with wide, dark eyes. The station had given Dan a larger room now, one meant for families. But Dan didn't feel like a father. He still felt like a simple maintenance worker who somehow got caught in a strange alien tradition. The door beeped. Someone was outside. Dan stood and opened it. Cyril, Luma's mother, entered. 2 other Yalari followed her, dressed in robes with symbols Dan couldn't understand. One of them carried a silver tablet. "Good morning," Cyril said calmly. "We have come to explain what happens next." Don rubbed his eyes. "You mean, what happens because your son thinks I'm his father now?" Cyril nodded. "Luma's choice is final. But there are steps that must be taken. Documents, customs." Dan looked over at Luma. The child had crawled closer and was now sitting near his feet, holding a glowing cube that made soft chimes. Cyril gestured to the tall Yalari beside her. "This is Elo, our lockkeeper. He will help you understand." Elo stepped forward, holding the tablet. His voice was quiet, but firm. "By Yalari law, the bond between child and chosen protector creates family. You are now seen as part of House Sir and Cyril's family line." Dan frowned. "I didn't sign anything." "You didn't need to," Elo replied. "The child's soul touch is enough." Dan folded his arms. "And what if I say no?" Cyril did not look angry. Instead, she looked sad. "If you walk away now, Luma will suffer. The bond will not break, only weaken. It would be like losing a parent. Yalari children do not recover easily from such things." Dan felt a knot in his chest. He looked down at Luma again. The child had stopped playing and was watching the conversation closely. His eyes were full of quiet hope. "But I'm human," Don said. "I don't know your ways. I don't know how to raise an alien child." "You don't need to be perfect," Cyril said gently. "You only need to care. That is what he chose in you." Dan stayed silent. Elo handed him the tablet. "This is a shared record. It'll guide you through our customs, food, language, and childcare methods. It also holds a record of Luma's medical needs. You are not alone." Dan took the tablet. Slowly, it felt heavier than it looked. Cyril took a small step forward. "We are not taking him back, Dan. This is not punishment. It is honor. Luma chose you for a reason." Dan looked at her. "Why me? I didn't do anything special." Cyril gave a small smile. He stayed when he was afraid. "That is more than many would do." Dan sighed and sat back down. "So what now? Am I supposed to take him to school? Feed him? Whatever Yalari eat?" "Yes," Elo said, "but you will have help. Yalari Guardian may request a support guide. We will assign one." Cyril knelt near Luma and touched his head gently. "He has not spoken since the escape, but he is strong. He will open up to you in time." Dan looked surprised. "Escape?" Cyril's face grew serious. "Pirates attacked the transport carrying our families. Many were taken. We fled. Luma was separated from me in the chaos. I feared I had lost him." Dan's heart sank. "He was hiding in the cargo bay for how long?" "Almost 2 days," Sorrel said. Alone, afraid, until he found you. Dan felt the weight of it now, not just the bond, but the pain behind it. Luma had been through something terrible, and somehow he had reached out for comfort. And Dan had been there. Luma suddenly crawled up beside him and leaned against his side. Don blinked. Slowly he put a hand on the child's small shoulder. I don't know how to be a father, he said softly. Cyril stood. You already started. Later that day, the station's commander called Dan to his office. Dan stood across the desk, still unsure if he was in trouble or being thanked the commander. A short man with a tired face looked at a report and sighed. Dan, you've worked here 6 years, no complaints, never late? Always quiet. Yes, sir. The commander looked up. Now suddenly, you're the adopted parent of an alien diplomat's child. Dan scratched his neck. Part of the plan, no, the commander said. But we've received a message from the Yellari Council. They're calling this a sacred event, and they're watching how we handle it. Dan blinked. You mean politics? Exactly. If we mess this up, it could damage relations with the Yellari. So I'm giving you full support. You'll get a room, food credits, childcare assistance, anything you need. Don nodded slowly. The commander smiled a little. Don't. That's an order. Dan left the office with a strange feeling in his chest. Not fear, not pride. Something between the two. Back in his quarters, Luma was drawing on a tablet. The picture was simple stick figures, but clear. One tall figure, one small one, and a warm yellow light between them. Dan sat beside him. That me? Luma nodded. Dan looked at the picture for a long moment. Then he picked up a stylus and added a simple shape above them, a roof. Like a home. Luma smiled. And for the first time since the bond was made, Dan smiled back. Dan woke up to a soft humming sound. It was still early, station lights were on. Dim mode. The noise was coming from the corner of the room. Luma sat cross-legged on the floor. His glowing cube spinning slowly in the air. He wasn't touching it. The object floated, moved, and changed shape as if it was dancing to music only Luma could hear. Don rubbed his eyes. You're up early, Luma turned, smiling. His large eyes sparkled with gentle light. Don sat up, stretching. His arms. You don't sleep much, huh? Luma tilted his head, thinking. Yellars sleep in short moments, he said softly. It was one of the first full sentences Luma had said to him. Dan blinked in surprise. You're talking more. Luma nodded. You listen more? Dan chuckled. Fair point. The station had assigned Dan a Guidrino, a calm and polite assistant bot with a screen for a face and a soft voice. Floated into the room just as Dan was brushing his teeth. Good morning. Dan Luma has a scheduled health check at 1000 hours, followed by a bonding exercise. Dan raised an eyebrow. A bonding what? An activity where guardian and child share learning time? Ellery tradition? They recommend puzzle solving or light engineering tasks? Dan spat out toothpaste. Engineering? He's 5. Reno's. Screen blinked. By human years, he is 5. By Yellari growth cycles, he is closer to 9. Mentally advanced, emotionally still growing. Dan looked at Luma, who was now gently taking apart a flashlight without tools. Just his fingers and... Focus. Okay, Dan said. We'll figure it out. Later that day, Dan and Luma were in a quiet room filled with machines and parts. The Yellari had sent a kit for the bonding session. Simple pieces. Small circuits, wires, and a glowing blueprint tablet. Luma sat beside Dan, woke carefully watching as he picked up a part. You know how this works? Nan asked. Luma nodded, pointing. This connects here. Power flows in a ring. Dan followed his lead. You've done this before? Luma smiled shyly. It's easy to feel. Luma tapped his head. I can feel machines, the way you feel music. Dan stared at him. That was new. You can feel machines? Yes, Luma said. Not just here. I feel their shape, their hum. They talk, a little. Don gave a slow nod. Well, that explains why you've been fixing the lights before I even noticed they're broken. Luma giggled. They worked together, piece by piece. The puzzle took time, but they finished it. A small hovering light that followed their hand movements. Luma touched the light and it began to spin gently in the air. Dan leaned back. Oh, not bad for a first project. You are slow, Luma said, smiling. Dan laughed. As the days passed, they found a rhythm. Don taught Luma how to cook simple meals well, as much as the station kitchen allowed. Luma, in return, showed Don how to read basic Yalari symbols. The child was patient, though sometimes he tapped his fingers fast when Dan got something wrong. In the evenings, they watched starfields together through the station's viewing window. Dan talked about Earth mountains, oceans, wind. Luma listened quietly, eyes wide. One night Luma asked, "Why did you stay?" Dan looked at him. "What do you mean? When I found you, why didn't you run?" Dan thought for a long moment. "I don't know. Maybe because I saw you were scared, and I knew what that felt like." Luma leaned against his arm. "I wasn't scared after that. They were becoming a family. It's not perfect, not always easy, but real. Still, not everyone was happy about it." One afternoon, Dan walked into the food hall and noticed a group of station crew whispering. They stopped when they saw him and Luma. A younger officer stepped forward. "Hey, Dan, that the alien kid?" Dan nodded slowly. "Yeah, his name's Luma." The man laughed a little. "Didn't know you were into babysitting." Dan's jaw tightened. "He's not a job, he's family. Just saying, seems weird. Alien rules. Adoption. Feels like a story, not real life." Dan put a hand on Luma's shoulder. "It's real enough." They walked past in silence. Luma didn't say anything until they sat down. "Do they not like me?" he asked quietly. Dan looked him in the eyes. "Some people don't understand things that are different. That doesn't mean you did anything wrong." Luma lowered his head. "I don't want to be trouble." "You're not," Dan said firmly. "You're the best thing to happen to me in a long time." Luma's eyes lit up. They ate quietly after that, but something had changed. The bond was stronger, no not just because of tradition, but because of choice. Dan chose to protect Luma, not out of duty, but out of care. One night, as Dan prepared to sleep, Brino's voice came through the speaker. "New message from the Yellorai Home Council. They request a visit from you and the child." Don raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Official reason. A cultural ceremony." "Unofficial reason. They are curious about the human who accepted a soul bond." Dan looked at Luma, already asleep in the small bed beside his own. He nodded slowly. "Tell them," Dan said. "We'll come." The space station Hollow Reach floated in silent orbit near the edge of human space. For many years it had been a place of trade, science, and peace. But lately, quiet whispers had started to spread. Something was changing. Dan stood at the docking bay, holding a small travel bag. Luma stood beside him, wearing a dark blue coat given by the Yellorai. The fabric shimmered slightly under the station lights. "Are you ready?" Don asked. Luma nodded. "Will there be food there?" Dan smiled. "If I know aliens, yes. It's probably something glowing." Luma's eyes lit up. "I like glowing food." Reno, the assistant bot, floated over. "Transport ship will arrive in 5 minutes. Yalri Council is expecting you on their moon settlement." Don nodded. "We won't be gone long." But before they could board, a warning light blinked on the station wall. "That's not normal." Station guard ran past, speaking quickly into his comm. "They breached a storage zone. Someone's trying to take something." Dan frowned. "Who's they?" No one answered. Hours later, the alert was cleared. But the station wasn't calm. Don sat in a small meeting room with the station commander, a tired woman named Talia, and Cyril, who had returned from her own ship. Commander Talia rubbed her forehead. "We've confirmed it. A pirate group slipped onto the station. Same symbol as the one that attacked the Yellorai transport last month." Cyril's face was calm, but her fingers were tightly folded. "They followed us here. Both of them." "Are they looking for Luma?" Cyril nodded slowly. "It is likely. During the first attack, they tried to take children from noble families. Luma escaped. They may believe he is important." Dan's chest tightened. He looked at Cyril. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "I hoped they would not find him again," she said. "Not want you to live in fear." Dan stood up. Well, now I am, and I want to keep him safe. So what do we do? Talia leaned forward. We've placed extra guards around your quarters. Luma won't be left alone. But I suggest you take the Yellery ship tomorrow. Their moon. Base is protected by their own fleet. He'll be safer there. Don looked at Cyril. You agree? Cyril nodded. Dan didn't like running, but this was bigger than pride. Luma was a child, his child, no and. No pirate was going to get near him. Then we leave at first light. Dan said. That night, Dan packed quietly. Luma sat on the floor, watching the stars through the small window. Are we leaving forever? He asked. Don shook his head. No, just for a while, till it's safe. Luma didn't say anything for a long time. Then he whispered, Will they come again? Dan sat beside him. They might try. But they won't reach you, I promise. Luma looked up. Even if they do, I'm not scared when I'm with you. Smiled a little. He wrapped an arm around Luma's shoulders. Then we'll face whatever comes, Dan said. Together. But not everything goes as planned. The next morning, Dan and Luma made their way to the docking bay. A sleek Yellery shuttle waited for them, guarded by tall warriors in silver armor. As they stepped closer, Reno floated near. Ship is cleared. Launch window is in 7 minutes. Dan nodded and held Luma's hand tightly suddenly. A sound broke through the air metal, clanging, alarms shouting. Unauthorized ship movement in Dock 2. Someone yelled. Dan spun around. He saw it a small black ship, unmarked, was rising. Fast from the lower dock area. Pirates again, he shouted. Sorrel appeared, her face pale. That's not one of ours. Guards moved quickly. Turrets on the ceiling locked onto the ship, but it fired back small blasts that shook the walls. Dan dropped low, pulling Luma with him behind a crate. Reno's voice came through the noise. Pirate vessel is jamming, comes. One target attempted. To reach the Yellery shuttle, Dan looked over the crate edge. Figure in dark armor had been trying to reach them. Now he lay still, hit by return fire. Dan turned to Cyril. They were trying to grab him. They wanted to take Luma right now. Cyril's eyes were cold. Then we end this now. She signaled her guards. They moved fast, pulling Dan and Luma toward the shuttle. Inside the ship, bright shields surrounded the walls. The pilot's voice came through. Launch in 20 seconds. Dan held Luma close. You okay? Luma nodded, eyes wide but calm. You didn't let go. Dan smiled. Never will. Outside station security fought hard. 2 more pirate ships appeared, but this time they were met by Yellery defense drones. Sleek, fast, and deadly. The pirate ships were OUTMATC. As the shuttle launched, Dan looked through the window. Hollow Reach grew smaller behind them. He didn't know when they'd return. They had escaped for now. Luma leaned against his chest. Will they follow us again? Dan placed a hand on the child's back. Let them try. On the Yellery moon, the sky was soft blue, and towers of light floated high above the city. Don had never seen anything like it. It was peaceful, clean, quiet. But even in this calm place, he stayed alert. He wasn't just a worker anymore. He was a protector, father, and someone had tried to take that away. Dan stood with Luma beside the council chamber doors. He didn't know what the council would ask or what their real plan was, but he was ready, because no matter where they were now, he had made a promise, and Dan always kept his word. Dan stood tall, though his heart beat faster than normal. The doors of the Yellery Council Hall opened slowly with a soft chime. Inside, the room was filled with light shining from floating crystals, not from bulbs or lamps. Everything seemed to glow gently, even the walls. Luma walked beside him, calm and quiet, as if he had done this many times before. Don, however, felt like he had just stepped onto a stage he didn't know how to act on. The Yellery Council sat, in a half circle, each member wearing long robes that shimmered like moonlight. Their eyes glowed softly, and their voices were calm but powerful. A tall councilwoman stood. Her name was High Speaker Inari. Human, she said gently. you have come far. You accepted the child's bond. You protected him from danger. And now you are here in our home. Dawn nodded. Yes, I'm here because I promised to keep him safe. Luma held Dan's hand tightly. The council noticed his connection to you is strong, said Inari. But we must be sure. Dan frowned slightly. Sure of what? That you are not just a moment of kindness, Inari replied. That you are a true guardian. That you understand what the bond means not just for Luma, but for our people. Another council member, Oren, leaned forward. We will test you. Dawn raised an eyebrow. Test me? How? You will go to the inner chambers, Inari said. And Nori said, we'll face 3 trials, not of battle, but of heart, mind, and spirit. Dawn looked at Luma. The child looked calm, but his small fingers were still wrapped tightly around Dan's hand. Dan took a breath and said, all right, I'll do it. Trial 1. The heart. Dan entered a small room lit only by soft blue light. The center was a floating sphere, pulsing. Like a quiet heartbeat, a voice spoke from nowhere, but it was gentle. Trial of the heart. Show what lies inside you. The light from the sphere surrounded him, and suddenly Dan saw images: his past, his failures, his loneliness. The days before Luma, when he lived alone, fixing small machines for trade, talking to no one, laughing at nothing. Then the image changed. He saw Luma, the child's laughter, his sleepy eyes, his curious hands. The way he had reached for Dan on the day they met. Would you still protect him if he never called you father? The voice asked. Yes, Dan said without thinking. Would you protect him if others feared you for it? Yes. Would you protect him even if it meant losing everything else? Dan looked straight at the light. Yes. He chose me. And now I choose him every time. The light faded. The door opened. Trial 2. The mind. This room was colder. A table sat in the middle with strange glowing pieces. A puzzle, but it wasn't just shapes. It was energy, movement, and balance. Trial of the mind, the voice said. Can you think beyond yourself? Dan sat down and looked at the puzzle. He reached for a piece, but the moment he did, another piece changed shape. Then he understood. Every move changed the puzzle. It was about more than one action. It was about how all actions connected. He paused, breathing slowly. This is like raising a child, he said to himself. Every choice I make affects him. I can't just think of myself. He moved carefully, slowly, watching how each shift changed the rest. After 10 minutes, the pieces glowed softly and locked into place. The door opened. Trial 3. The spirit, though. Third room was empty, just Dan in silence. But then the floor beneath him began to shift. He saw himself standing across the room, a perfect copy. Same face, same clothes. But something was different. The copy looked at him with cold eyes. You are not ready, it said. Don frowned. Who are you? I am your doubt. The part of you that still believes this was all a mistake. You are not strong enough, not smart enough. Just a human lost in an alien world. Dan stepped forward. I may be just human, but I'm not lost. The copy laughed. You think you can raise him? A Yalari child? You think you can protect him from pirates, from politics, from fear? Dan's voice grew steady. I don't know everything. I can't promise I'll never fail, but I will never stop trying. He's my son. He chose me, and I chose him. Copy blinked, then faded into light. The door opened. Back in the hall when Dan returned. The council stood in silence. Inari stepped forward. You passed the tests. Dan looked at her. Wow. I didn't come here to prove myself to anyone. I came here for Luma. But if your tests help you understand that time, glad I did them. Oren nodded slowly. Few speak so honestly. Yeah, you are not like many humans we've met. Dan gave a tired smile. I've heard that before. Inari walked toward Luma, who had been sitting quietly at the side of the room. Child, she said, softly, you chose this guardian. You still wish to remain with him? Luma didn't even hesitate. He ran to Dan and took his hand. Yes, he said clearly. He is my father now. The council nodded, double quotes then, by our laws, and by your bond, Inari said. We recognize this human as guardian and family. The child is his, and he is the child's. A soft glow surrounded Don and Luma, a symbol of the soul bond fully accepted. Don knelt beside Luma. We did it, kid. Luma smiled. Together, Don and Luma now lived in the Ellery Moon City, a peaceful place where soft lights floated above the streets, and the sky never turned dark. It was always a gentle blue, even at night, thanks to a glowing mist that drifted high above the rooftops. Dan had been given a small home near War, the learning center where Luma studied. The house was simple but filled with soft colors, round furniture, and warm lights. Reno, the helper bot, stayed with them, often making quiet jokes that only Luma laughed at. Dan was starting to feel safe, but safety, like peace, can be an illusion. One evening, Dan sat outside with a cup of yellery tea. It had a strange taste like warm rain and honey, but he had grown to like it. Luma played in the yard using a floating toy that responded to his voice. Sorel visited them often. She still wore her silver robe, and though she rarely smiled, she always brought food or stories. You were settling well, she said that night. Dan nodded. It feels like home, almost. Sorel looked at Luma. He is growing stronger. His energy is more stable. That is good. Dan raised an eyebrow. Energy. Sorel nodded slowly. The Yellari children are different. They connect to the world around them. When they feel safe and loved, their energy becomes balanced. Don looked toward Luma, and if they don't, then the bond weakens, Cyril said quietly, and darkness can enter. Dan didn't like the sound of that. Just then Reno buzzed over. Urgent message from high speaker Inari. Dan stood quickly. Play inside Luma, he called. The boy nodded and went in. Dan opened the message. Inari's calm voice spoke. A Yellary scout ship found signs of pirate movement in nearby space. We believe they are searching again. We must act before they find you. Dan's jaw tightened. The next morning, Dan and Cyril met with the council. We believe the pirates are tracking energy signals, Inari explained. Luma's presence is unique. They may have a way to sense him, Orin. The other elder added. We have a device that can shield his energy, but it is unstable and untested. Dan crossed his arms. And if we don't use it, they will come, Inari said. They always come. Dan looked at Cyril. She was silent, but her eyes said enough. She was worried too. I'll try the device, Dan said, but only if it doesn't hurt him. That afternoon, Luma sat on a smooth silver chair. A small round band was placed gently around his wrist. It glowed for a second, then went dim. Do you feel anything? Don asked. Luma blinked. It tickles. The council tech nodded. It means it's working. For a few days, everything seemed calm. No signals, no warnings. Luma continued his lessons. Don helped the Yellari workers fix old equipment in the city. Sorel visited often, but then one night, the sky changed. Don was awoken by the sound of sirens soft. Musical tones that signaled danger in the Yellary city. Reno floated in, alert. Pirate ship detected above the outer sky ring. Shields active. City defenses engaged. Dan jumped up and grabbed Luma, who was still half asleep. Where's Cyril? He asked. Already on her way, Reno replied. Outside, bright lights blinked across the sky dome. The floating mist turned red. Something had pierced the outer barrier. Dan ran with Luma through the city streets, guided by Reno. Other families moved to calm but quick. The Yalri were used to preparing for danger without panic. Cyril met them near the underground shelter. Come, she said. This area is shielded. They won't find him here. As they entered the tunnel, Luma looked up. Why do they keep coming? Dan didn't have a good answer, because they don't understand. They think they can take you and use you for something. But they're wrong, Luma nodded. I'm not going with them. Dan smiled. Good, because I'm not letting you. Inside the shelter, the council gathered. They had already activated the inner city shields. Pirate ships hovered above, but could not land. Oren showed a map. They're scanning for his signal. But the device is working. They haven't found him. Don asked. Then what are they doing? They're waiting, Inari replied. Watching. Hoping we slip. Dawn paced. We can't stay locked in forever. What if they keep circling? Cyril stepped forward. Then we force them to leave. Dan looked at her. How? We create a false signal, she said. Make them think Luma is somewhere else, far from here. Dawn thought for a moment. A decoy, Inari nodded. But someone will have to carry the signal beacon and lead the pirates away. Dan didn't wait. I'll do it. Cyril looked at him. It will be dangerous. Dan nodded. They want him, not me. I'll make them follow me. Luma stood up. No, I'll come too. Dawn knelt beside him. You have to stay here, where it's safe. I'll come back. Luma's eyes filled with worry. Promise. Dan placed a hand on his head. Hey, promise. The next morning, Dan left the city in a small shuttle. The signal beacon, disguised as Luma's energy, blinked softly beside him. The pirate ships moved almost instantly. They're following, Cyril said through the cum. Be careful. Dan flew low across the moonscape, fast and unpredictable. The pirate ships chased him. They believed he was the child. They believed they would win. But Dan had a plan. Near the edge of a crater field, a trap had been set. The Yellery defense ships waited silently. As Dan flew past the trigger point, he shouted into his mic, now. The Yellery ships appeared from the shadows, fast and bright. They surrounded the pirates in seconds. A short battle followed, but this time, the Yellery were ready. Dan's shuttle landed nearby. He watched from the ground as the last pirate ship was disabled. Cyril's voice came through. They're retreating. We have one. Dan smiled and leaned back in the pilot's seat. Good, because I made a promise. That night, Dan returned to the city. Luma ran to him, wrapping small arms around his waist. You came back, Luma whispered. Dan picked him up. Told you I would. The council met them near the light garden. Sky had returned to soft blue. Peace, once more. You risked your life, Inari said. Don shrugged. That's what fathers do. The council bowed slightly. Then you are more than just a guardian. You are family. Cyril stepped closer. They will not try again. The message has been sent. Dan looked up at the stars. Let them watch. We'll be ready. Luma smiled beside him. For now they were safe. For now they had peace. Peace had returned to the Yellari Moon City. The sky, once lit with warnings and sirens, now shimmered with gentle lights again. Floating crystals glowed like stars above the buildings, and the glowing mist above the dome had returned to its soft, blue hue. Dawn stood at the edge of a garden filled with silver trees and glowing flowers. Luma ran ahead of him, laughing as he chased a small hover drone, his steps light and joyful. It had been 3 weeks since the pirates were driven away. No more signals, no more threats, just quiet. Safe. Dan sat down on a smooth stone bench and watched Luma play. A gentle breeze passed by, though there was no real wind inside the dome, just the quiet hum of the city's systems and the peaceful rustle of energy. Cyril arrived beside him, holding 2 cups of warm Yellari tea. You look tired, she said. Dawn smiled and accepted the cup. I think I'm just finally relaxing. Cyril looked at Luma, her eyes soft. He is different now, stronger, happier. He's healing, Dan said. Maybe we both are. Cyril nodded slowly. Do you still plan to stay here? Dan looked at her, then back at Luma. This is home now, not because of the buildings or the sky. Because of him. Wherever he is, that's home. That evening, the council invited Dan and Luma to a special gathering. The light garden was decorated with floating lanterns, and soft music played from unseen instruments. Hi, Speaker Inari stepped forward and addressed the people. We are gathered to honor the bond between 2 lives, a child who chose his guardian, and a human who accepted that bond not as duty, but as love. Dan stood beside Luma as the council formed a circle around them. The Yellari believe family is not always by birth, Inari continued. Family is built by care, trust, and protection. Tonight we recognize this human not just as guardian, but as father, in name and in truth. Glowing crest formed in the air, a symbol of unity. Luma stepped forward and placed his hand on the crest. Dan followed, placing his hand over Luma's. The symbol shone brightly, then faded into both their skin as a faint light marked something only visible when touched by yellowy light. The bond was complete. They were now, by every law and tradition, father and son. The days that followed felt new. Don began helping more around the city, fixing machines, learning their systems, teaching simple mechanics to ELRE students who were curious about human knowledge. He even helped build a new learning pod in the city's edgy, a place where both Yellery and other species could study together. The Yellery had slowly started to open up. Realizing that maybe not all outsiders brought danger, Luma joined the new classes too, excited to make friends and learn new things. He especially loved music and drawing and would often bring home strange instruments or glowing pens to show Dan. One night, Luma asked, "Can we plant a tree?" Dan blinked. "A tree." "Here," Luma said, pointing to a quiet spot near their home. "I want something that grows because of us." Dan smiled. "Then we'll plant one together." With help from Cyril and a few builders, they found a small Yellari sapling. It looked like a mix of silver branches and soft glowing leaves. They dug a small hole, placed the sapling inside, and covered it gently. Dan handed Luma a small bottle. "Water it gently." Luma poured the glowing liquid into the soil. The tree pulsed softly, as if breathing. "It's beautiful, Luma," whispered Don, put a hand on his shoulder. "Like you." That night, Don wrote a short message to Earth using a secure Yellari signal relay. He had not spoken to anyone back home since arriving, but now he felt ready to Earth registry. "I'm alive. I found something here. Or maybe it found me. His name is Luma. He is my son. I won't be returning to Earth, but if anyone ever comes here, tell them we are safe. Tell them humanity is capable of more than war, more than fear. Tell them. Love isn't limited by stars." Danny sent the message and leaned back in his chair, watching the stars through the ceiling. The next day, Luma asked Dan a question that made him pause. "Will I look like you one day?" Dan chuckled. "No, not really. You're Yellari. I'm human. We look different." Luma nodded slowly. "But we're still family, right?" Don picked him up and spun him gently. "Always. Family isn't about looking the same. It's about standing together. It's about choosing each other every day." Luma smiled wide and hugged him tight. "Then I'm glad I chose you." Dan closed his eyes. "I'm glad you did too." Years passed. The tree they planted grew tall. It's glowing, leaves lighting up the street at night. Luma became a leader among his peers, smart, kind, and strong. He never forgot where he came from. He never stopped calling Dan his father. Dan, though older now, continued teaching, building, and living with a quiet joy. He had come to the stars as a wanderer. He stayed as a father. The city changed. It welcomed more species. It built bridges to other moons. It became a place of learning, peace, and hope. But in the garden outside their home, one thing never changed: a silver tree, a small bench beneath it, and sometimes a boy and his father, sitting together, watching the sky. The end.